So we will be recording this and posting it to our web page. So if anybody in your office would like to view it, or anyone else who mentions it to you, it'll be available probably by Monday. And I wanted to just show you our new web page that has some information, or a lot of the information that we'll share with you today. And also the templates that we'll talk about for the new process for submitting your IE plans. I also wanted to mention that Allie Michael, our assistant director who's here today, worked very hard on all of this and should be presenting this, but she has no voice. So I will be doing the talking, but she will monitor the chat. So if you have questions in the chat, please feel free to join. We also have Brandy Bickham here today, our academic affairs technical support coordinator. Brandy helps with Nuventive, but she will also be helping us with this new process for submitting the plans once we get it off the ground. So let me just show you this web page, assuming I can do a share. Here we go. Can everybody see that? Okay. So over here on the left, you'll see we have this link called IE Planning Resources. This is a new page where you can find a lot of information for all units, all types of units. And if you scroll down, there's information about our workshops. It gives you some of this basic information about IE planning. We try to keep it as direct and brief as possible. You can also download a print version here if that's something that you want to use or keep in your office or on your computer. And it gives you sort of the basics about IE planning for the different types of units. So at Austin P, we have 3 different types of units that are sort of governed by how SAC-COC defines units for institutional effectiveness. The first is degree and certificate programs. And then the next 2 are the folks that were invited to this workshop today. One is academic and student support services, and the other is administrative units. So SACS kind of gives you guidelines, but we get to decide who fits into which category. Typically, academic and student support services is most or all of student affairs, as well as other student support or academic services that might be in the provost office, like the registrar, learning resource center, APSU 1000, things like that. Administrative units are pretty strictly administrative. They're not necessarily directly involved in the educational programming or don't even directly support it in that way. It's more of a units like advancement, athletics, so many, we have so many, public safety, everyone. So essentially administrative units it helps us cover the whole university for institutional effectiveness. And then we'll talk more about this timeline today, but it is on there. And then at the bottom of the IE resources page, you can find these links to the new IE planning templates that we're going to be asking you to use to submit your plans for next year, for 22-23. And those are due much earlier than normal. So that's one of the reasons we're doing that today. Your 22-23 plan is due by February 21st of this year, of 2022. Through this new process, which is basically involves downloading one of these Word templates, one of these 3 based on your unit type, filling it out, and emailing it to us at iea@apsu.edu, which is on there on the form as well. So we'll let you know what that is. So this is kind of what we're here talking about today in terms of the process. I know some of you are newer to this. Oh, and Allie put the link in the chat to the page for you as well. Up until now, all of this has happened in Nuventive, which is our assessment software. We still have Nuventive, we're still using Nuventive, but we're using this new deadline for the plans, which will be reviewed by the IE committee, as sort of a pilot of doing things a little differently. So we're hoping that this word form is a little more logical to people and it asks you to think about your plan in a more holistic sort of narrative way. Nuventive can feel a little piecemeal when you're putting stuff in. And it will also be helpful on our end so that we can see how you're thinking about it holistically. And when the committee reviews it, it's actually easier for them to review in that more narrative form. So we're trying this out, and we will see how it goes. So before I move on, we have sort of a presentation that I think some of you have seen before, but we will include it here because we are recording this and we want to make sure that everybody has this information. Just sort of the basics of IE planning so that you can have that in your mind as you're working on this Word form to submit your plan for 22-23. So before I do that, I'm just going to pause and ask if you have questions about the new process or the timeline. And there'll be more chances to ask questions. Thanks, Loretta. And you can always chat, you know, as I said, Allie doesn't have a voice, but she can do the chat. So she will help us with that. All right, let me just turn the slide presentation on. Right. Allie, are you seeing the right thing? Okay. I can't tell. Okay, so again, some of this is going to be a repeat, but it bears repeating. So here's sort of the overview of IE planning for academic and student support services units and administrative units. There are minor differences between what we ask those two types of units to do, but for the most part, it's the same. So first, we just want to talk a little bit about what is IE. It's really about continuous improvement. So that's sort of the end goal of all of this. Sometimes it can feel like we're just collecting data to collect data. That's really not the point. The point is to use that data to identify actions that can help you improve or build on strengths or improve the operation of your office, whatever that might be. So this is the cycle and it's meant to repeat. You basically say what your outcomes are, you plan assessments of those outcomes, ways to measure them, and then you collect that data, you analyze it, you talk about it, you disseminate it within your office or with your colleagues and have conversations. That's the important part. And then through those conversations and that analysis, you identify actions you want to take based on those results, whatever that might be. Sometimes that's, you know, maybe correcting a deficiency or you didn't quite perform at the level that you want. But other times it might be like, hey, we're killing it. We really went over our target. What does that mean? Does that mean we need a different target? Does it mean we need to be measuring something else? Can we measure it in a different way? All those types of conversations are the things you want to be having within your unit or with your team. And if you're an office of one and that's challenging for you, we are happy to have that conversation with you. One of Allie Michael's main roles is to work with academic and student support services and administrative units. And she's already had those conversations with folks and she'd be happy to talk through it. Sometimes you just need somebody to bounce it off of. And we're happy to fill that role. So why IE? It's really about what matters to us and are we making progress on the goals that we would like to be making progress on as an office, as an institution, as a degree program, whatever that might be. So it gives us sort of a way to do that at the granular level by unit, but we eventually hope to have those conversations across units as well. And that might happen, you know, in a division. So for example, in student affairs, they might be collecting data and having conversations at a unit level, but then, you know, at a division level, maybe they're sharing that information and having those larger conversations as well. So SAC COC isn't the only reason we do this, but it is a reason. And 7.3 really speaks strictly to those administrative units. So they actually have an entire standard dedicated to admin units. And this is that standard. I won't read it to you because it's boring. But it basically says Administrative units, which is basically anything other than a degree or certificate program or those units that support those programs, needs to be having outcomes, it needs to be measuring those outcomes. Section 8 is the one that speaks to degree and certificate programs, but also academic and student support services programs. And the primary difference between academic and student support services office and administrative offices is that academic and student support services offices have administrative outcomes, but can also have student learning outcomes. So they might be providing more direct educational sort of content to students. So you might think about the registrar's office, and you wouldn't think about them as student learning outcomes, but they might be working with students to have them understand how to use DegreeWorks, for example. So they could have a student learning outcome for maybe trainings they're having for students about that. Certainly something like an APSU 1000 or a PASS program, those are a little more directly educational. So we kind of allow academic and student support services units to determine if student learning outcomes are reasonable for them or not. But if you feel like they're not, we do ask you to have a pretty good reason to not have them. So kind of it's unit by unit, but administrative units only have administrative outcomes. So that's really the only difference between those two types of units. So I know we're right now especially focused on strategic planning because the institution is getting a new strategic plan. If you're in academic affairs, we have a new strategic plan. Some other units you might do it even within your own office. So we'd like to highlight the difference between IE and strategic planning. Essentially, IE is about what we do now every day, like our basic business that we conduct on a daily basis, or the basic services that we provide as the function of our office. Strategic plans are about the future. Where are we going? What do we want to be doing? That's primarily the biggest difference. So when you talk about IE outcomes, you're focusing on your current services processes. And when you're talking about strategic planning, it's like aspirational. Where do we want to go? How are we building toward that? So at APSU, there's basically two big chunks of IE, of institutional effectiveness planning and reporting. So one is the plan, which is what we're basically talking about today in terms of what we're asking you to submit for next year for 22-23 on that word form. And that's these elements: a mission statement, your outcomes, the measures of those outcomes, and achievement targets for each of those measures. So that's the portion that we call the plan. Then there's the report, which is what you submit after you've collected the data, analyzed it, and identified the actions. And the IE report includes the plan, but also includes these two elements: the findings and the action plan. So minimum requirements for administrative and actually academic and student support services units as well is this. So we ask that every unit have a mission statement. If you do not currently have one, we're happy to help you develop that. And we have some slides in this presentation that talk about it. But a lot of times you already have mission type stuff out there, might be on your website, might be in materials that you have for your office. Somewhere out there, you've got the language of what the mission of your office is, but the mission is meant to guide your outcomes. So we ask that all administrative and academic and student support services units have at least one AUO for each major service or function. So for instance, in IEA, we're an administrative unit, my office. And we basically have 3 or 4 large service buckets that we work on. So we have an outcome for each of those. So Gina McCullough works on QAF. We have one related to that. Brandy works on technical stuff. We have one related to that. And then Allie and I do sort of a combo of different things, and we have a couple for that. If you're an office of one, that still might mean that you have more than one major service or function, unfortunately. But minimum of 2 AUOs per unit. So even if you're very small, we ask that you have at least 2 AUOs. Then, if SLOs are appropriate for you, student learning outcomes, you can kind of figure that into the minimum 2. But that sort of depends on the type of unit. And administrative units are not at all required to have student learning outcomes. So it doesn't mean you can't if you feel like you really want to, depending on the function of your unit. We can talk about that with you. Measures, we ask that you have 2 measures for each outcome. Now, we can be sort of flexible on this. There are some outcomes that there's really only one appropriate measure, or you don't have the capacity to do a second measure for different reasons. But you want at least 1 direct measure at a bare minimum. And then you have to think about when you're going to assess those outcomes. So if you only have 2, maybe you want to assess those 2 outcomes every single year. That's perfectly fine. But maybe your unit has 5 outcomes and you feel like you can't do all of those every year, or you don't want to do all of those every year. We do ask for these types of units, for admin units and academic and student support services, that you try to measure all your outcomes within 2 years. So maybe it's that in 1 year, you're assessing outcomes 1 and 2, and in the second year, then you assess outcomes 3 to 5. And then you sort of repeat that every 2 years. But you get to determine kind of how that works within that 2-year cycle. So the new templates can be found on this page, which we also put in the chat, the word templates for your 22-23 plan. And we would like you to submit those via email to our office by February 21st. And then we will be compiling them for the IE committee to review in March and April of this year. And then we will return that feedback to you by May so that you have time to finalize your plan and get it back to us by August. So if you want to pull your past IE plans from Nuventive, or you need to see those and you're not sure how, that's definitely something that Brandy can help you with if you want to reach out to her. If you're like, I need to look at 2021 or 21-22, and you're not sure how to do that, or you're new to your office, either way, Brandy's happy to help you look for that in Nuventive. So switching to the components of a plan. So the first thing we'll ask you to do is to articulate your mission statement. Some of you may already have this in Nuventive. We hope that you do. But this is also sort of a good office exercise to kind of kick off the planning process. You might, if you have a mission statement, you might want to revisit it. I know a lot of us have been through a lot of change over the past couple of years, whether that's turnover or shifting functions of your office. It might be a good time to revisit that and just make sure that your mission statement still accurately reflects what your office or your unit does. So the unit mission sort of fits into the institution mission and our strategic planning goals, which are kind of TBD at the moment. But we do have the new APSU mission. So make sure you check that out and think about how your unit mission aligns with that as well. Strategic plan goals, those might be developing, but these are sort of the basic buckets for the moment. And you want to think about those as you articulate your mission. So your mission statement is basically a focus for the purpose, the administrative purpose, the educational purpose, whatever it is of your unit. We recently had a little office retreat because we've had some things change, and we came up with a new mission that really we felt like fit us. And that was actually a really constructive exercise to lead us to our new outcomes as well. We have a little template, so if you don't know where to start, this is a good place to start. It kind of helps you just plug in things, language that you might actually have in other places to create what is a basic mission statement. So then from the mission, you want to identify your outcomes. So many of you already have your outcomes. Everybody actually should have outcomes at this point. But if you're new to your unit and you want to sort of rethink this, one of the things we're asking you to do with this new process is to look at your outcomes as a whole. What is the set of outcomes for our unit? And are they what we want them to be? So you can go into Nuventive, pull out the outcomes that you already have, and maybe talk with your colleagues or ask yourself if it's just you, are these still what we want them to be. So we have two types of outcomes, as I've mentioned already at Austin Peay. One is administrative unit outcomes, and those are basically statements of your current operations or services. So they're not things you plan to do, they're not goals of what you want to do, they're things that you do on a daily basis or annual basis, whatever that is, in your office. There are things like, they focus on things like efficiency, accuracy, effectiveness, comprehensiveness, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Student learning outcomes, pretty self-explanatory. They're statements of the learning that you hope that students get out of a degree or certificate program, or maybe out of a training or a student experience, such as orientation. Those can have student learning outcomes, things like that, a library session. There's all sorts of different things that can have SLOs. And student affairs has these. Theirs might be a little more developmental, affective things that they hope students get. But essentially they highlight the knowledge, skills, abilities, or values that you believe students should be demonstrating at the end of a program or an experience or a training or whatever that might be. But the key is student learning outcomes focused on students. The subject of that sentence should always be students. Administrative unit outcomes is about your office or your unit or your program. And the subject of that sentence should always be the name of your unit, office, or program, or some function in that area. So AUOs fall into, these aren't the only buckets, but these are some of them. You want to focus on having services or functions that are effective, accurate, high quality, comprehensive. Those are some words that you could pull out actually and use even in some of your AUOs. So I won't read through all of these, but we have this PowerPoint and we will post it on the website so that you can download it. These are examples of AUOs for sort of each of these buckets. And again, these aren't the only things, but they give you a sense of what these might look like. So accuracy, for example, these are not Austin Peay offices, these are completely made up, but procurement and contracts. So they might have an AUO for accuracy that says procurement and contracts accurately processes purchase orders. So the key of that is that they, for the measure, then decide what they mean by accurate. So like, what do we want that to look like? But this gives you the basic statement. And then as an office or a unit, you can sort of define what timely is. Is timely in 24 hours? Is it in 36 hours? Is it in a week? It just depends on what service you're offering. So these are examples, but your outcomes are very contextualized to your office. And this is a place where getting an outside perspective is very helpful because we are so in what we do every day that it can be very hard to write this sort of generalized outcome in a way that makes sense or that is useful. And that's where Allie especially, but myself as well, we're happy to give your outcomes a read over, and we'll probably ask you lots of questions, and that helps you develop them. We'll say, well, how do you process purchase orders? What are the steps, or who's involved in that? And that helps you kind of get to the place where you can either write an outcome or define a measure that makes sense for that outcome. But it can be very hard to see those things when we're sort of in our daily business. So we're happy to help with that. So this is for SLO. So if you are an academic or student support service unit that is not a degree program and you want to think about SLOs, we're happy to help you work on those as well. But sometimes those units just have one SLO that maybe is based on a major thing that they do with students to help them learn how to do something or be able to do something on their own or learn about health services or whatever that thing is. They might have an SLO related to that. Either way, all outcomes, whether AUOs or SLOs, should focus on current, what is happening now. I would say one of the biggest, I don't want to call it an error, but an error that we see is that folks are so used to writing maybe performance goals or even office goals that they write things like, we are going to acquire this, or we're going to achieve this. that's not really what an outcome is. And this is a good moment for me to say that outcomes are not personal performance goals. They are not individual employee performance goals. They are about the office. They transcend you as an individual, even if you're an office of one. So anybody in that role should be able to understand what those outcomes are. And you are not being measured, the offices or the unit is being measured. So that's important to remember. You want to make sure that your outcomes are about things that you actually do. Sometimes, you know, education is very collaborative, right? So like we're working with different units. In my office, we literally work with every unit at the university. So we have to think about what do we have control over? We can't actually, as much as we'd love to, we can't actually control all of you. So we have to think about what is it that we can do? So you want to keep it realistic and keep it about the function of your office rather than what you're maybe depending on others to do. Most importantly, you want them to lead to improvement. And that can be hard to see if you've not done this before. So that's another thing that we are happy to consult on. You want to keep them fairly simple. You don't want an outcome that is what we call bundled, that has like 5 different things in it that you're going to do. So if it's a compound sentence, you might want to think about that. Like, is this too many things in one outcome? Maybe this one outcome could actually be 3 outcomes. That happens a lot. So think about keeping it simple. And try not to have them be yes or no, either we did or we didn't do it. That's tough. But a lot of that is about wording. So we can help you wordsmith it if necessary. You want to think it, instead of thinking of it as yes, no, did we do it or not, think of it as degrees, like how much did we do it? Or how little did we do it? To what extent did we do it? Trying to phrase it that way. And ultimately, you want to be able to link them to the strategic plan goals once we have a better sense of what those are for the future. So now we want to think a little bit about measuring those outcomes. So once we have the outcomes, we have to be able to measure how well we're doing them. So for administrative outcomes, usually that's things like quantitative data that we collect or that we learn to collect if we're not collecting it already. You know, things like response time or how accurate something is, how efficient something is. You kind of can define how you collect that. A lot of us are collecting different types of counting and stuff like that anyway. So this is a way to use that. Client satisfaction level, a lot of us are using this, especially for IE. So that's things like surveys, feedback questionnaires, focus groups, whatever that might be, but a lot of folks are using surveys. Then sometimes some of us work on things that have external compliance. So quality assurance funding in our office is an example of that. We get a strict set of standards from THEC. So part of us is just a part of our IE plan is how well we foster compliance with those standards. So sometimes it's like outside agencies that you're working with and you can create sort of a measure and outcome, or maybe they do it for you in sort of a way that helps you do that. So that applies actually to a lot of administrative offices in different ways. So measures should actually measure the outcome. That's probably the most important thing to remember. Like, is this really measuring the outcome? And sometimes you need to measure it in multiple ways. Sometimes there's really only one good measure and or the one that you can actually execute, and that's okay too. You want it to, as much as possible, span all APSU instructional sites and delivery modalities. So don't forget about Fort Campbell. Don't forget about if you do things online for online students or online employees, whatever that might be. Making sure that the data you're collecting is somehow inclusive of everywhere that we, for lack of a better term, provide services. That's a SACS thing, but it's also important for us because you don't know how you're doing unless you're really looking at how you're doing with all populations. So if you have questions about that, we're happy to help you think about that. And again, multiple measures are better. One is fine. So we want to keep that in mind. And mostly, I want to say that your measures should be practical and manageable. If it is not something that you can actually get done in any given year, it is not helpful. Now, does that mean that you won't have to do something new or add something to your sort of task list? You might. We had to do that when we created our plan, but you want it to be something that you can do in a reasonable way. So again, we can kind of help talk through that with you if you need us to, but it's not a useful measure if you can't actually execute it. Or maybe it's a measure where you can collect the data, but then it's too much to analyze. That's not helpful either. So just, we want to make sure that how you're collecting the data is something you can use and that you want to use. And that's where we really promote you using things you're already doing as much as possible. So many of us are already sending out surveys, or already tracking something or counting something or submitting something to an external agency. How can we use what we already have? Like, that's where you should start. So this is again about the multiple measures when you can. If you can't, one is fine. Just want to stress that. So every measure has to have what we call an achievement target, which is basically just a level of performance that you expect or that you hope for. And the wonderful part about achievement targets is you decide your own. So there is not some outside idea of what your achievement target for a measure should be. It's whatever you think is appropriate for your office now or your unit. So what we will say is that, you know, depending on what the measure is, you don't want to totally lowball it. The point of this is to find places that you could be better, that continuous improvement thing, or just to find out how you're doing at all, because a lot of us might not really have a sense in any concrete way of how we're performing on a particular service or function that we provide. So sometimes these numbers do come from the outside. You know, maybe your division has a certain idea of how quickly you should respond to things. Maybe, you know, whoever oversees your unit has said, well, we have to have like 80% accuracy on this. Maybe that comes to you, but if you don't have those sort of parameters, you can base your achievement targets on what you might reasonably expect based on your experience. So it might be that, oh, I have a sense that for the past couple of years, we've turned things around in like 2 days, but sometimes it's more like 5. So let's choose 3 and hope that we get it done in 3 days. Essentially, when you're thinking about targets, they're usually something quantitative. So it's a number. It's, you want to do 85%, or you want to do 4 out of 5, or you want to have, you know, your turnaround time is 24 hours, or whatever that number is. We try to get you to avoid things like 100%, or the most or majority of things, and try to be more specific. 100% isn't great, because then it's really either we did it or we didn't. There's no sort of room for growth. Usually when I see 100% target, that just means that the outcome actually needs tweaked, that there's something in there that isn't quite working out. So I'll use the registrar as an example. I forget what it was, but I think it was verifying transcripts or something. And obviously they want that to be 100%. That is not something we want to mess up. So instead of that, we work backwards with them to talk through what are the steps to verifying a transcript. And then they sort of used those steps as more of the outcome, and to see where they could improve the steps rather than the verification of the transcript itself. But again, very contextualized to each unit, but try to think about things where you have some variability. So just a quick note about surveys, since so many of us use them, whether that's like more of a formal survey or it's like an exit 3-question slip you're giving somebody on the way out of an event or whatever it is. You always want to be analyzing that for IE by question. So you don't want to be looking at the results on the survey overall. You want to be looking at every question. So if it's a, if you're asking respondents to rate something on a scale of 1 to 5, you don't want to look at the average of all the questions. You want to look at each question, what was the number that they rated us, or whatever, however you're doing that. The reason for that is because when you do it as a composite score, when you look at the average across the whole survey, you miss areas where you might be doing very well and areas where you might be doing very poorly. And so, they might rate 4 out of 5 of these components as a 5, but the quality of food is a 1. That's something you want to know. So that's why when you describe your measure, always describe it for a survey or a questionnaire, as we're going to analyze each question. So again, we just want you to think about how can we measure the effectiveness of what we do? And that I'm not going to act like that's easy, because it's not, because that's not how we always think about it. In higher ed especially, we're very big on counting stuff. How many students did we see? How many employees did we help? How many events did we have? All that is super important. But if we can't tie it to, that's just how much, that's not how effective. So if we can't tie it to how effective, it's not as useful for this type of process where we're trying to improve the way that we do things. So that's just something, food for thought. So in this presentation, I'm not actually going to show you all of this, but we do have an extended example that is not from here, it's made up, that sort of shows you, I'm going to go, how this looks in totality. So this is more what the form is going to look like that we're asking you to fill out, where you take an outcome that you're measuring and you list that outcome, you describe the measure, and then you describe the target for that measure. Same for the second measure for that same outcome. So this is measure 2 of that same outcome 1 and the target for that. So if you're wondering like what this should look like in a narrative form, this is a kind of a good example of that. That will give you some of the things that we're asking you to include on that form. This is what an example of when you have findings, what that will look like. So we're taking that same plan from this fictional campus police public safety office, and then we're adding, oh, here's what they found once they executed the measure, and here's the actions that they took based on those findings, or that they plan to take. So we're not there yet for 22-23, but you will need to report results for this year. So all of you should be executing your plans for 21-22, collecting that data, and then we will ask you to report it this summer. Everybody will have to report by August. But you'll actually be thinking about your 22-23 plan first. That's what we're asking you to think about first. Okay, more examples that you can look at. So just a reminder of the minimum requirements. You got to have a mission statement. You need to have outcomes, minimum of 2. Measures, we wish for 2 measures, but we're okay if it's 1. And then you have to have a plan. Are we going to assess all outcomes every year, or do we want to sort of stagger it out? So time-wise, just to look at this for these 2 types of units, our office is currently compiling feedback reports on, for those of you that submitted results reports from last year, from 2020, 2021. The committee reviewed those, and we have now made feedback reports. And if you submitted results for 2020, 2021, you will receive a feedback report from us. Allie hopes to get those out to these units this afternoon. Administrative units were not required to submit results reports for 2020, 2021. Academic and student support services units were required to submit results reports for 2020, 2021. So if you didn't submit something, you won't get a feedback report. If you did, you will. And we hope that that feedback report, with feedback from the committee on your previous results report, will help you review your plan for 22-23 that we're asking you to submit next month. This feedback is meant to be formative. It's meant to help you make changes to improve your plan. So we're hoping that will be useful to some of you. And then your unit will develop your IE plan for next fiscal year for 22-23. Then you will submit that plan using the templates we've been discussing for your unit type to us to this email address by February 21st. The committee will review those plans in March and April and return that feedback hopefully by early May or mid-May. And then your unit will revise your IE plan and submit the final version to us by August 1st. Also by August 1st, you will need to report your results for this year. So in addition to this new plan for next year, you'll also have to submit your results reports for 21-22. We are not totally sure how we want you to do that yet. So we don't know if we're going to ask you to do that in Nuventive or in a Word form. We're going to kind of have to see how this plan pilot goes, but we will be checking in with you about that soon. So just next steps. So now you're going to get a feedback report from us from your 2020, 2021 results reports if you submitted one. You're going to work on your plan for 22, 23. You're going to submit that plan using the new form via our email address. They will review the plans on the committee. We will provide you feedback on your 22, 23 IE plan. And then you'll have time to work on that. And then in August, you'll submit your final plan as well as your results report for this year. And before this semester is up, we will have another workshop on results report, just so that you understand what that process will be and what you need to be doing for that. Okay, here's our emails. We are happy to help. Ellie doesn't have a voice right now, so don't call her on the phone, but you can send her an email. Hopefully by next week, she'll have a voice. And she is your primary contact for basically all non-degree units. I am the primary contact for degree and certificate programs, but either one of us can help with either. We just try to divide it up a little bit. So we will share the slides as well as the recording. Okay. So someone asked, does it matter how many people respond to surveys? Sometimes responses are really low. Short answer is no, it doesn't really matter, except that in your analysis, you kind of want to describe that as a limitation. So that's where that fits in. So in your analysis of results, you would say, here's what we found, here's what we think it means, but it's really limited by the fact that we only had 3 people respond or whatever that is. And in there, I would say that, you know, maybe one of your actions is that you want to find a way to increase response rates so that you can get better data. But that happens to a lot of us who send out surveys. So, you know, and if you need help brainstorming ways to increase response rates, though I have no magic solution for that, sometimes it helps just to talk through other options for collecting data other than the survey if that's something that's not working well. But you can still use that information. It's information you collected to create actions. You just have to qualify it by saying, we know that the response rate is really low. That's okay. Other questions? All right, well, thanks everybody. We appreciate you. And if your colleagues want to view this, please send them to our webpage, or they can just email us. That's fine too. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great weekend. Stay warm. It's chilly out there. Thanks, Sarita.